Hello, good afternoon. And while people are coming in, I'll take this opportunity to welcome you all to the third panel of our Climate Action Challenge. Before we start, we always like to thank our sponsors, Hypertherm Associates, the guest of the day, Sunrise Labs, Unitil, Worthen, and our media partners, NHPR and NHBR. Today, as I mentioned, we have Hypertherm, and we're going to discuss climate strategy and integration. We have two guests. Robin Tyndall is a Hypertherm Associate Environmental Stewardship Team Leader. She has over 20 years of experience in the environmental stewardship field and guides Hypertherm towards their 2030 sustainability goals. She holds a bachelor's degree in environmental engineering and a master's degree in business and currently resides in Vermont. Jamie Green is the environmental specialist at Hypertherm and facilitates green practices throughout the organization, chair of the Substance Use Disorder Task Force, and active member in her community. We have a discussion forum, so feel free to type your questions in chat. We will not be doing slides today. We are just going to hear directly from the experts, and we really wanted to do this to make it accessible and to allow you to ask your questions. So I'm going to hand it over to Robin first and ask about their journey. How did they start? And tell us about the climate strategy, how your company set climate goals and targets, how does it align with your broader sustainability goals, and the journey you were on so far.
Great, thank you. So I'll start out way back early in our journey. We set our first set of goals in 2010. And I think at that point, there wasn't necessarily in the common lexicon the phrase climate action plan or climate strategy. That was definitely part of what we were doing, but we didn't necessarily word it or frame it that way. So our initial set of goals was made up of carbon reduction goals, specifically energy efficiency goals, and waste goals. We kind of separated it into those three categories, even though there was some obvious overlap. And that was really just for the purposes of communicating and making it clear. In terms of our process for developing those goals, in retrospect, some of it seems a little bit backwards. We didn't have great measurements in a lot of the categories. We did have a consultant early on help us with a very basic carbon footprint, and that definitely informed our goals, but we also didn't want to be kind of stuck with only what we were certain of in terms of our starting point and have that constrict or restrain our goals. So we certainly set some goals that we didn't even have a baseline for. We didn't even know where we were, and we took an informed guess and set a goal. And so looking back on that, we had some goals that were too easy, some goals that were way too hard because we didn't know how we were going to get there or even what our baseline was. And then we had some that were appropriate and really kind of drove us forward over the decade. I would also say in retrospect, something we didn't know at the time was that definitely the most engaging goals for our broad associate base, which is now up to 2,000 people, and at that point was more in the 1,000 associate range, were the waste goals. And that was interesting to us. It makes sense because waste is visible and tangible, and everybody can participate in it. And so that really we kind of saw as a gateway to conversations and action on the other goals. So, of course, waste goals are connected to climate goals, but there's an indirect connection. It's not necessarily kind of comprehensible to everyone, but visually seeing waste and being able to do something about it that day and every day really helped us kind of grab people. So that's just kind of like the basic outline of how our goals were at that point in time and how they connected not just carbon, but other environmental goals. So I'll pause there for questions on that piece or for Zena to continue.
So just, and I'm remiss, I should have mentioned this before, just a background of who Hypertherm is. You're in heavy manufacturing and you provide industrial solutions to other heavy manufacturers. So we're talking about a carbon intensive sector, and you guys have around 12 buildings and 1,200 employees in the US, and you are global. You have presence in Europe as well. So you have a very large footprint to work with as well. So I'm curious, when you do get these, start planning these goals, it's good to have goals, but then you need to implement them, and then climate becomes everybody's responsibility. So Jamie, if you can give us a sense of how does Hypertherm foster a culture where climate responsibility becomes ingrained in the mindset of all your employees? How do you actually provide incentives, training, certification? What structure do you put in place to implement these goals?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that first and foremost, our mission statement is a triple bottom line philosophy of people, profit, and planet. And so I think that is really the cornerstone of all of our culture at Hypertherm. Taking care of our associates first, our planet next, and then worrying about profit later. But we do have what we call the Greener Cuts program. As you said, we are an industrial cutting solutions company. And so the Greener Cuts program is the idea that we want to make sure that every cut made with our plasma or water jet technology is as green as possible. And so we have a green champion program. And so those are basically ambassadors for their teams in green. And so they act as somebody that disseminates information from the corporate social responsibility team to the broader community. And we have, we've communicated the goals. We have LEAF certifications, 1, 2, and 3 LEAF. And those really, the way I like to explain them is kind of like the kindergarten, high school, college of environmentalism, right? So 1 LEAF is like you're really just starting to understand, what is carbon? Why do we care about it? How do we even begin to measure these things? And then as you go on towards 3 LEAF, it becomes more and more progressive and robust, as in, waste reduction projects, energy baselines, all of those things. And that's really spearheaded by the Green Champion. But we certify teams, and so it is a team-based certification program, and it can have anywhere from 10 to 20 to 30 projects that are involved in that, and they're all really we do it pretty strategically so that we get what we'd like to see from the team. And so we're even in the process of developing a 4 LEAF, and those are for the early adopters to really re-engage them in our environmental program. But I would say that, it really does help that we're an associate-owned company. I think that pride in our company really helps to leverage engagement in our program. We do surveys each year, and we continue to be the highest rated pride point, right? Corporate social responsibility is really what, gets our associates excited to show up every day.
So you've seen it on employee attraction and retention. Can you expand, Robin, maybe on the employee retention part? Because you have evidence that this strategy has actually been meaningful for your employees.
Yeah, like Jamie was just saying, our engagement surveys that are done every 18 months, when we ask questions about what people are proud of, and the way they ask the questions alongside other questions, they're able to gauge what the drivers of engagement are. And again, that was the #1 hit. So what it's showing is that people are really proud of that work. They feel like they can make a difference, and they feel like they can participate in it. So that really gets to kind of those motivators of purpose and autonomy that you hear about when you hear about engagement. And so we definitely have also seen with people who are not here yet, people who are in the interview process, people who are candidates, that they're more and more asking questions about what what our environmental goals really are. Of course, they can do the research and look on the website, but we've had some that are really like putting us to the test. I had an engineer recently tell me that he was on an interview panel and that the engineer who was the candidate was grilling them, he said, on what we were really doing. Like, she wanted answers. And I think that that's just going to happen more and more. There's what I've heard called a trust gap, between the public and businesses in general. And people are aware of greenwashing, and people are aware of, oh, it looks good, but is it real or not? And so I think that as we are trying to attract and retain the younger generations, they're going to be more savvy about really detecting what's real and really what the values of a company are that they want to align with their own values. They're not willing to, say, be a different person at work than they are in their own personal life in terms of their values.
We have a quick question, Robin. You mentioned that with your first plan, there were a lot of questions that were really hard, or you didn't have the way to measure progress. Like, do you report that out to your employees? Do you try to explain where you might have missed a target, or just have a hard time measuring them? I mean, are you transparent in terms of
definitely
progress or lack of progress?
Yeah, in fact, I'm glad you asked that, because I think that even just the way that we set our goals with making things very measurable, it was because we are a company of engineers and we thrive on measurement. I mean, our products are all about super high tolerances and super sophisticated measurements. So we knew if we were going to have these people buy into it, it had to be something that was measurable and not vague, right? So we set to do the best we could without expecting perfection, or without saying, oh, we can't do this at all because we can't measure it perfectly enough. And then, yes, like you said, transparently saying where we got it wrong. So one specific example is we set a goal of a 20% carbon reduction for our products, but we hadn't done a life cycle assessment at that point. So we didn't even know what the carbon impacts of our products were. And like many companies that do a life cycle assessment, we were quite surprised by the answer. And therefore, we weren't prepared and did not make any progress on that. So when we communicate that, and we've done it many times, we have the goals on a slide, we have what each goal was, and we had a big red square over that one that said 0% against a goal of 20%. And, interestingly, we had a recyclability goal of our products being 100% recyclable. Because we're talking to engineers, when we had our products assessed by a third-party e-waste expert, it was determined, depending on the product, we were between 99.5 and 99.7% recyclable. And we had people on the executive team say, that will be reported as 99.5 and 99.7. It will not be rounded to 100. So yes, people want the truth, and that builds trust too.
Can you guide us a little bit about specific initiatives and programs, Jamie, that you've done or green team successes that you want to highlight, and how they work together? Do they volunteer for these positions, or do you kind of tap some certain departments?
Yeah, so we have what we call cultural immersion, and that's our onboarding process. And so I do my little spiel on our champion programs. We have many champion positions. So green is just one facet of the champion program, but there's also continuous improvement and community service time, things of that nature. And so I like to plant a seed early on that this is something that you're passionate about, that this is an opportunity for you. I started out as a green champion in the warehouse, and so I used, my experience there to leverage skills for this role. And I share that with associates as well. It's an excellent opportunity to build skills and talent where you just were not proficient before. I do also suggest that they don't pursue a champion role until they have at least 6 months to a year under their belt, because we all have another job that we need to be doing, and wanting people to be really secure in what they're doing before they take on additional responsibilities. But it is a volunteer program. Of course, there are some instances where people may get voluntold. That never works well. And so we do really try to discourage that. Um, but yes, so I mean, the Green Champions, they're all extremely driven people, very creative, and really, looking towards the future and trying to make, our community and our environment the best that it can be. There's a lot of barriers to the work, with unprecedented staffing shortages and competing priorities. There's always challenges, but they continue to show up regardless of that. We've had 5 teams this year certify at a new LEAF level, which is a record. In previous years, COVID really kind of derailed the program quite a bit because of unprecedented production and all of the other constraints and people just trying to like show up to work and survive. Um, and so it's been really nice to see the program really reinvigorate. We also have, as you said, we have a zero waste goal at Hypertherm. And so Green Champions also, they volunteer each year for a week to dig through all of our landfill trash to see what's in there, which sounds a lot grosser than it is. It's actually a really interesting process. And it just continues to impress me, how willing they are to show up and learn and get their hands dirty, and really how proud they are of their contribution to the company.
And Zena, I'll build on what Jamie said with another success story example of a Green Champ. The whole purpose of the Green Champs is that they're the experts in their area, right? Like as a high-tech manufacturer, we have lots of different, very narrow focus areas, and there's no way that our team is going to understand how those processes work and then how to make them more environmentally responsible. And so this particular example was with one of our reliability labs. So they're actually testing our products, and they use a ton of water to do this. And we brought to their attention that they were using a ton of water. They really already knew that anyway, but we said, okay, this is a concern, kind of built the case a little bit for spending some time on it, and had great leader support in that area. So leader support is really huge. So this particular leader, he was awesome in saying like, okay, you're going to have X number of hours to work on this, to his Green Champ. And he also said, take some risks. Like this doesn't have to be perfect. Think of it like a science fair. You're just like trying it out, and like maybe it'll work and maybe it won't. And he really kind of didn't expect it to work. But this lab technician came up with an awesome design. He built it himself. He used some, low cost or free spare parts that were sitting around. And he literally created a project that saves 100,000 gallons of water a month. So it was awesome. It was a huge success. And he was really engaged because he got to do this very like inventive and innovative thing. And the best part is we have other labs that use water in slightly different ways, but similar enough such that they can come see what he did and adapt that for their own needs.
That's a great point. And he actually was so passionate about that project that he documented every step of the way. So it's 100% replicable. I mean, he collected part numbers, everything that anybody could need. And like Robin said, we have many labs that do very similar work, but maybe, siloed in their own areas and not be able to talk to each other. And that brings up another thing. We have an environmental summit each year. We're actually coming up on one next week, where he will actually share the results of this project. And so, associates near and far will be able to say, wow, here's a contact person that I can talk to about my water usage, and it brings up a great point of having those conversations with the experts, right? Because I met with him and his leader, and they were struggling with a project for what we call a green business indicator, which is modeled off of a key performance indicator. It's a metric that they choose to track throughout the year with the goal of decreasing something in the environmental context. And so, just by me mentioning their water usage, you then see the light come on and they say, oh, well, what about this? And what about that? Sometimes it's really difficult for people to contextualize their footprint. But once you give them that first initial thought, just to see them run with it, it's just phenomenal. So yeah, definitely. That's a great point, Robin. Thank you.
I really want you, Robin, to tell us how your strategy evolved as you started getting more data and understanding of where your footprint really lies and how it expanded beyond to include your customers and what you're doing to work with your customers right now?
Yeah, so after we set our goals in 2010, we started doing life cycle assessments, and we used a consultant to help us with that. And we really had to pace ourselves and do it slowly because it's expensive. So we kind of did one product family at a time. And we were actually pretty fortunate in learning the results. Did not have a lot of what I'd call conflicts of interest, meaning we didn't have an impact that was really bad with water use, but really good for carbon. Everything was directionally the same for the different life cycle stages. And the same was the case across different product families. So our controls, our biggest industrial products, and our smaller ones all had the same profile, which made it quite simple to say the number one contributor to our carbon, water, human health, everything else footprint is our products being used at our customers. So it was very clear. That said, what's not very clear is how to engage our customers, and that's because we're really a B2B company. So we sell through OEMs and distributors. I mean, think of it like when you buy a computer, the chip inside might be made by Intel, but it might be Microsoft that makes the rest of the hardware. So we're just like that chip. Really big products, but they go on to even bigger products and then get sold to the customer. So it's hard for us to have that one-on-one connection with customers. And honestly, we're still working at educating and engaging our sales force and our technical service people and anyone who interfaces with the customer to bring up these conversations about impacts, to be proactive about it. That said, sometimes customers will contact us first. It's rare at this point, but I can say with pretty high certainty that customers will be asking us more and more these questions about the carbon impact of our products that they then use to make their products. We've had one customer who's asked us very, very specific questions about that. And luckily we were able to answer them, very sufficiently and pretty quickly, because we already had the data. So we really would have been in a panic and would have looked pretty incompetent if we hadn't been able to do that. And then just this year, 2023, we've had some customer visits specifically to learn about our sustainability practices. And we had a very big purchase from a very large customer. We often have customers that are much, much larger than we are. And they specifically said during that purchase process that the alignment with them and us around environmental values was one of the key reasons that they chose to purchase from us.
So you worked specifically with certain software, and can either of you highlight how you provided some solutions for these customers and the business case you made for them, the return on investment to actually pay attention to how to use your product?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so our equipment cuts metal and other materials. So think of like a gear for a John Deere tractor being cut out of a huge piece of metal. It's like almost like a cookie cutter. And so when you think of actually making cookies, you try to fit as many on the piece of dough as you can. So we do that, but with steel or marble or plastic. So those raw materials for our customers are one of their major expenses, right? And you, of course, want to turn your steel or plastic, whatever you just spend a ton of money on, you want to, if you could, turn 100% of that into parts, right? Like the cookies. You don't want to just throw out the scrap. And of course, when we make cookies, we don't throw out the scrap. You roll it out and do it again. And so it's software that helps us fit as many pieces as possible onto the sheet of steel or plastic or whatever. And it kind of seems easy when you think of it as cookie cutters, but when you think of like the mathematical number of combinations and permutations of orientations of complicated parts and how you should really fit those on there, given the constraints of the technology, it gets pretty complicated. And so we've been working on our software for a long time around productivity, both from the material standpoint and speed standpoints, and just kind of process quality. So you have all these trade-offs. And we most recently developed a new algorithm that allows people to get the parts even tighter. And of course, the ROI for them is their utilization rates are something like 70 or 80%. So you're buying this expensive raw material and immediately turning 20% of it into recycling scrap. Not a smart business model, right? Turn 98% of it and 2%. And so it's pretty easy to make that case, but the way that customers account for scrap is complicated and sometimes not rational. And again, we have to have these conversations with customers, sometimes through a third party like a distributor, in order to even get them to pay attention to it and to consider the trade-offs. It might take a little longer to do that cutting process if you have to let the algorithm do the thinking. So we have to convince them that that's worthwhile.
I want to make it available for others to ask questions. So if you have a question, please come online or put it in chat if you prefer not to unmute. In the meantime, I'm going to switch gears slightly. This week, we focused on building resilience and adapting. And you had several experiences with extreme weather events, and you're located in an area where you got hit with flooding and several hurricanes that affected your supply chain. I'm wondering what specific measures and strategies you've implemented to build resilience in your operations, supply chain, facilities, if any.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. It's hard. I mean, one great example, it was maybe at this point 2 or 3 Februaries ago, where there was a big freeze up in Texas. I don't remember if people remember that, like people's houses and pipes and everything were freezing. And of course, the factories were freezing as well. And we had a key supplier there that was just completely shut down. And so they could not send us our parts. And we were also, we were lined down, meaning we couldn't produce products that required that raw material or that component. And so it was one of those well-timed crises where I could take advantage of it by explaining this is one of the products that we had been working on a return to recycle program. And so trying to get customers, when the product is at the end of its life, to send it back to us so that we can ensure that it's 100% recycled. But the other piece of that is, well, what if we're not technologically there yet, but what if that particular very rare kind of high-tech plastic that was stuck in Texas could be recovered from that product that we had people return to us? We would be much more in control of our own fate. We would be much more resilient to having a supplier in an area that's hit by an extreme weather event be kind of holding us hostage to our own production. And so it was really good for me to be able to use that example, that circularity and product returns are part of a resiliency strategy.
Jamie, could you explain what is asked of the green teams when they submit? What is the approval process when they go through ideation? And I know you said you encourage mistakes and think of it as a perhaps a science project and it could fail or not. But what do you ask? Do you ask to see measurements of return on investment on these initiatives? Do you see business plans? Do you see and what support system do they have to implement these projects that they come up with?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with GBIs, we just ask them to track a metric. And so it could be that metric being tracked just kind of reiterates that they're continuing on the right track, right? Like they haven't gotten any better, but they also haven't gotten any worse. It could be that, like, for example, for our reliability lab that's tracking gallons of water used, that it could be an astronomical amount of savings, and that also builds in resilience, right? And so it really depends on what the project is. A lot of energy baseline projects, they have to work with facilities to get those systems metered. We do a lot of metering in the Upper Valley. We've just started metering water out in Kent, Washington at our Omax location. And so there is a lot of tangible data that goes along with a lot of these things. But some of the things are a little bit more innocuous where, for example, they choose a process and they map it out. And the idea is that you start to look at this process through an environmental lens to see what are your environmental inputs and what are your environmental outputs. Now, it could be that when you go through this process, there is nothing that you can eliminate, right? I mean, we are an industrial manufacturer of cutting solutions. Like you said, we have an extremely large footprint, and some things are just going to be a necessary, expenditure. But other things are like, wow, do we really need this particular item? And so really a lot of these projects are asking them to get used to looking at things differently. When we do waste reduction projects, what waste comes into your cell that is not necessary, right? What do you unpack that immediately goes into a waste stream? Can we work with the supplier to send that back? Is that supplier an external supplier or are they in Hypertherm, right? It could be a team 2 cells down and we're generating waste within our own 4 walls. And so it really depends on the project. I certainly don't ask for, business cases or anything like that. That would be much higher level, something that Robin would take care of. But on the team level, we really do give them the autonomy to pick what they're doing. Again, I am not a machine operator, so I am not the person to tell a machine operator what they can do with or without. And so really seeing them be creative in their processes. For example, we had a cell that did a process map on mopping, and mopping seems really, like no big deal, right? But when you're cutting brass, you have lead contaminant, right? And so at the end of this process map, when it comes to the fact that we evaporate our water and hazardous sludge is left over, that brings a whole new lens to that process, right? Oh, wow, mopping creates hazardous waste. And so, being able to pivot from filling up an entire mop bucket versus a quarter of a mop bucket, things of that nature. So it really can go to either side of the spectrum. It could be small savings and it can be, huge, just groundbreaking innovations. But really, we ask that just the fact that they're looking at these things tends to trickle throughout all of the work, right? It's just like zero waste. When we first started our zero waste goal, we had many, many tons of items going to the landfill, right? And so by prioritizing zero waste, we ended up centralizing our waste stations, which meant that we, quote unquote, kicked the can, which we took all individual waste bins away from workstations and cubicles and whatnot. And so, which people were surprisingly very resistant to. But what happened with that is that you're saving custodials so much time by going cubicle to cubicle or workstation to workstation that now we can weigh every single bag that leaves the building, right? Because they're not wasting time on other things. And so, it really, I think, depends on what you're putting the focus on. We are now at 1.11% waste to landfill, which we were at 0.8% for the last several years, but because of some contaminated zero sort and some items that we've been sending to the landfill that are no longer accepted, we now have to pivot and figure out where that stuff goes, right? So, I think any kind of focus on anything environmental can have really great outcomes.
1.11 sounds like such an engineering number.
we literally measure everything that goes out the door. So every waste bin in our buildings has a number, which is tied to that bin to a team. And so, during our New Hampshire landfill audit, we'll get the bag with the building number and the bin number. We will dig through that entire bag, and everything that should have been zero sort will go into one pile. Everything that should have been compost will go into one pile. Every rubber band will go into a pile together. And then we weigh all of our separate, items that we find in there. And that gives us really actionable data, right? Like, why are we wasting 7 pounds of rubber bands every week, or whatever the case may be. And that gives us, a lot of a lot of insight as to what are the gaps in education. Why is this one particular item always in the wrong bin? You know, and then that really informs a lot of our other processes too, right? Like we identify the gap and then we target our education and our training towards that, and can sometimes we'll even add a certification criteria to address that as well.
I just wanted to take a minute to encourage everyone, if you have any challenges you're facing, to ask Robin or Jamie their thoughts. You can tell they work with a lot of different elements. And so I just encourage you to ask your questions. They might have an innovative approach that could help you get beyond your challenge.
And I'll tag on to that ROI answer too. There's typically an ROI out there, but it is not always easy to see. Like Jamie was just saying, it might be that it's a safety issue. It might be that it's a hazardous waste cost. It might be that it is a packaging savings that you can get from your supplier who doesn't need to create as much packaging. So you really have to kind of like wedge your way into these processes when people are making decisions, and really make sure that they're accounting for all of the benefits that can come along with a change that is also an environmentally beneficial change, because they're not used to thinking about all of those connections.
And you mentioned briefly that customers are coming to you more and more about your carbon footprint, and I'm assuming that the regulations and updated regulations are going to cause even more questions, because you're in their supply chain. So we know the SEC is considering the reporting. We know California passed its own reporting laws, and we know that you work in Europe, and Europe has its own regulations. So how does your advanced strategy or set you up for competitive advantage? And do you want to touch on your 2030 goals, and if you feel like they're keeping you abreast of regulation or ahead of it?
So yes, the goal is to be ahead of regulation. Absolutely. I mean, we have one good example of that that was from before my time, and now an old news kind of regulation, but RoHS. We basically, a lot of our product categories were exempt from that, but because we were doing one, we did all of them to make them all RoHS compatible, so that when that exemption goes away, we'll be ready. We did it on our own timetable. And that is, people, I think, felt the benefit of doing that when they were doing the one product family that was not exempt. They were in a big rush. And when they were doing the other one, they could do it on their own timetable and be prepared. So I try to talk about that a lot. There are some that we are well prepared for because we're doing it ahead of time. And there are some where we're not, where we just find out about it at the last minute and we have to hustle. So definitely with the SEC regulations, like I said, we have a lot of customers that are much bigger than us and much more unlikely to be public, whereas we're private. So we don't have to report our emissions to anybody at this point, but they do, and they will be asking. So I try to bring that up a lot, that being proactive will be helpful. And having an entity in Europe and having a lot of customers in Europe is actually a help to us, right? Like sometimes it feels like, oh, this is a pain, but it's going to save us when those regulations come to the US that will have already done it, even though a smaller percentage of our sales are there. And those regulations, I think, are moving fast. I anticipated that they'd move fast, but they're even moving faster than I anticipated.
Yeah. Jamie, I wonder, you have a gold LEED certified building, and I was wondering if your employees appreciate any specific features of that gold certification, or if you found that going through that certification, some things worked, others were not as useful for you, or any feedback on going through that process.
So the LEED certification happened before I was in this role. So Robin could speak to that a little bit better than I can. But I will say that we do a lot of tours of our building, and it is well received by both associates and people in the community. I think one of probably the two main things that garner a lot of attention are our water filtration system. So our water just circulates over and over again. Of course, not gray water, but we do save a lot in that sense, especially because we do have, anode stations that are cooling, while products are getting tested. We also have an oil circulation system, which we cut with canola oil. And so that circulates over and over again, and saves a lot of hazardous waste and just wasted oil in general. So those two, I think, are the most impressive. We also do light harvesting. We have, we have a rock garden that gets watered by our roof. So we have permeated pavement outdoors. So, I mean, I think it's a phenomenal building. But Robin can definitely talk more about the process itself.
Yeah, so I'd like to connect the LEED certification to resiliency. So Jamie just mentioned the permeable pavement. If you've ever seen or been to our building, it feels very long and narrow, and you might think that that's because of our production process, and it's not. It's because of the land and the wetlands around us that we built to avoid the wetlands. We also built very oddly shaped parking lots. They're not just like squares and rectangles, again, to avoid the wetlands. And I can guarantee that this building would have flooded if we hadn't done that, because we've had these huge rain events over the past few years and come close to flooding. And if all of that water was not soaking into the sponge that is a wetland and was not going through our pavement, and instead it was pooling up on it, we'd be in big trouble. That said, we haven't had a drought necessarily yet, but we will. And the water saving project that was built into the infrastructure here in the building will save us when we have a drought. We will be able to continue our product testing and the new product launches that depend on it because we can reuse that water. Whereas the municipality will say to us at some point during a drought, you have to stop using water. So those were definitely big wins. In terms of challenges, the way the LEED certification was written at the time around public transportation did not understand what a rural area we lived in. So we tried, but like having a bus come here 24 hours a day does not make sense, right? There would be nobody on the bus and it would be driving around empty. So like we got 0 points for public transportation, even though we tried. Surprisingly, the daylight piece has had its pros and cons. Again, being high tech, we have lots of optical readers and lasers and very sensitive equipment. And so some of our skylights have these like black shower caps over them, which you only see when you're out on the roof. And you're like, that's a gigantic black shower cap on our skylight, which is supposed to be giving us free light. Well, it's because the team underneath it has these pieces of sensitive equipment, right? So that's live and learn, but hey, it's there. And when we rearrange our furniture, so to speak, and our equipment, hopefully we'll be able to arrange things a little bit differently. But that can be frustrating when some of those things don't go as planned.
Again, you have the opportunity, you have someone who's been through it right here, and feel free to ask your questions or unmute or drop them in chat. Thinking ahead, what are the biggest challenges that keep you up at night? What is that thing that keeps you thinking?
What do you think, Jamie?
I think for me, it's competing priorities, getting a place at the table. Not that, sustainability is extremely important at Hypertherm, but we have so many things that vie for, attention. And I do think that we constantly have to advocate, that this is coming. And oftentimes, I think senior leadership or the company in general can be concerned about putting out the fires that are here right now, and can be a little bit short-sighted about those that are coming, that we know absolutely are coming. And so really just the barriers. I would say that that's it. But I am also, recklessly positive that we will show up and we will get it done. And I just am continued to be so impressed by our CSR team and yeah, I'm excited for the challenges.
I'd say that one of the things that I worry about when I talk to other people. So I was just at a 1-day conference that was all about net zero carbon. So everybody there like already got it. And they were talking a lot more than I expected about what I would call like perfection measurement, and which standard to report to. And there's like, in some ways, there's like this explosion of standards. It's like, do you report to CDP, UN Global Compact, GRI standards, GHG protocol, SBTI, right? I mean, you have limited time to do this. And I found that some of the people there who were talking about their process and their strategy were spending 100% of their time on just getting the measurements going, which is necessary. But I also think that it's, at least to me, like not that inspiring to not do anything. To me, it's like saying like, I'm gonna do great on my weight loss, but I'm building a scale. Well, you can do other things in the meantime, right? You can take some just like general rules of thumb and start to apply them. And so I think that's what I like about our approach is I want to see results. I in that way kind of I am short-sighted some of the time. I want some rewards, right? And like you get the psychological reward from having some success and addressing the low-hanging fruit. So I would say that's my constant tension is how many things to report to and talk about versus like, well, just do them and then you can talk about them later.
Yeah. So I'm big takeaway. Perfection is the enemy of progress. I'm getting a lot of make mistakes. It's okay. Let's continue on our journey, revise and continue. Rachel, did you have any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Robin and Jamie. I'm Rachel from Revision Energy, and so I spend a lot of my day thinking about energy, and solar in particular. I know it's something you guys have looked at different points in the past in New Hampshire specifically, but I'm just wondering if you could speak to energy in general, because for any company, it's going to be a huge part of their carbon footprint. And given you guys have other sites, I mean, I've had the privilege of looking at some of your sites here in New Hampshire, but maybe some learnings from other European locations. Is there any advice you'd have on looking at the energy portion of Hypertherm's impact, knowing that it's a tricky one to solve, and if every rooftop could accommodate all the solar a business needs, that would be amazing, but it's not often the case. So yeah, I'd love to hear you speak to that topic.
Yeah, it's a timely question because just today and yesterday I've been experiencing frustration over getting on-site solar. It's hard in New Hampshire. Again, we can't be perfect. And I think that we're probably a few years behind where we should or would be because of kind of maybe our sticker shock when we did some RFPs and we looked at like how much we can generate with solar on our property and then how much we use. It was basically like high single digit percentages, 8%, 6%, whatever. And we were like, oh, that's pointless. Like we're not doing it or we have to wait. In retrospect, like 8% is 8%. Like that's still a lot. And like to have 8% go to zero carbon, it's like it's pure additionality, to use that lingo. And it's meaningful and it's real and people see it and people are proud of it. And it is an embodiment of something that is abstract, right? Like energy is kind of abstract, and we do renewable energy credits or certificates, and we hope to participate in PPAs and aggregations in the future. But all of those things are invisible and they're financial instruments that regular people can't understand. And so the value of that intangibility is huge, and getting over the sticker shock of thinking that you're going to do 50% or 100%, but you can only do 8%, do it anyway. That would be my advice to my past self. And And I guess, yeah, it takes partnerships too. Like the project I'm working on right now is really involves several companies beyond Hypertherm to make this thing make sense. And so you have to kind of rely on those experts too, right? Like experts from Revision Energy can help other companies understand this and get their minds around it because, right, Jamie and I have a million other things to do. We're not going to become the experts in that. So we need help, and it's okay, I guess, to need help.
You might have touched on it a little bit, but do you want to comment on the role of business in advocating for state policy to keep up? Because you're based in New Hampshire, and New Hampshire tends to be slower than other New England states, but you live in Vermont, which is a more progressive climate state. So do you have a role, or does Hypertherm have a role in moving that forward?
Yeah, so Hypertherm has solved the NHBSR clean energy principles. We've signed a few letters when there's bills up in front of the state government. I personally think we could be doing more, and that business does have a role. Yeah, I do think that I guess I'm getting more comfortable in just stating the facts, right? Like New Hampshire is behind the other New England states in incentivizing clean energy, right? No, that's just the facts. So I do think that businesses in general could do more about advocating. But we can also just do what we're doing now, right? Sharing best practices, helping each other understand and learn from each other's mistakes.
And Lonza is asking, I think it's Katie from Lonza, asking about your process for carbon assessment or life cycle of the products. Would you be willing to share more information, maybe contacts, and I can relay those, or about your experience going through the LCAs?
Yeah, definitely. You learn a ton doing LCAs. You really need a lot of collaboration in the organization, depending on what you're making, but between the engineers or the designers or the material scientists that create the product, as well as people who use it, as well as people in the supply chain. The software that helps you do it, I think, is getting better, kind of easier to use by a layperson as opposed to an LCA expert. We haven't done that yet. We've only used the experts, but we're thinking about that, because I think what our future ideal vision would be to do highly iterative, quick LCAs, basically with design change possibilities before they're baked into a final product, obviously. So baselining and understanding where your products are is a first step, but if you can use it to make decisions in real time, that is the gold standard, right? You can choose this material instead of this, or this process instead of this, or this weight of this material versus this weight of this material that accomplishes the same function. That can really drive your decision making. And so we're not there yet, but what we have done has been a huge and great learning experience.
And if you share the contacts of the experts that you used, I'll forward those to Lonza as well.
Yeah.
We have a few minutes left. If there's any questions, please feel free to ask. I wanted to leave you on a higher or uplifting note, instead of something that keeps you up at night, something that you're really excited about, or something that you're hopeful for in the short term, something that you're excited to work on.
Jamie, do you want to start? You
That's
just
a great
unmuted.
question.
What I was going to say was just we were brainstorming yesterday. We're late, don't tell anybody, for our UNH Sustainability Fellow. They're so nice to extend the deadline for us. But so yeah, we're brainstorming, and that's super exciting, right? To say, like, if we have 10 weeks of like a motivated student with all this knowledge and background, like what would we do? That's fun because I think because of its short scope, right? To say, well, we've done this in the past, and we do it with Dartmouth groups as well during the academic year. What can we scope that they can accomplish that will just kind of get us a big jump ahead in that topic. That's really fun to do. And it's just it's the other side of the coin from like the super long-term goals, right? Like that can be a bit heavy, like 2030. How are we going to get there? What are we doing? Plodding along to do something that instead is like, what can we do with 10 weeks of a super smart young person?
And you did use them well last year. You want to talk about what you did last year? Because that was really impactful. The carbon pricing.
Yeah. So, and yeah, carbon pricing was actually 2 summers ago that we had an intern look at carbon pricing. And it's funny, our other colleague, Darren, is on a phone call right now with our logistics team who has volunteered, not even been voluntold, but they have volunteered to be the first team to implement carbon pricing internally on themselves. And so that's really cool. And we're just taking the work that Catherine did and giving it to them, helping them learn and internalize it. We did the same thing with our CFO. He is on board, and we're going to pilot that process.
Excellent.
Yeah, I would say carbon pricing is definitely the most exciting thing. I think it has, a lot of potential for freeing up funds for us to do really big ticket projects with, and also to really add, that tangible consequence to, capital expenses and stuff where people may not be considering that. But then also like just the smaller things, right? Like I feel like everybody can make a huge impact just being a proponent for the environment, and it doesn't necessarily have to be anything targeted. I was having a conversation with a close friend of mine, and at the end of it, I was volunteering at a recovery conference, and she sent me a thank you card, and she said, because of our conversation, I'm going to stop using K cups. And for me, that is phenomenal, right? Like, and that just came from an earnest conversation about waste and things that we use for convenience that really we just shouldn't. And so just the small changes too, I think, are really exciting. And I think of how other people's brains work, and it just is so amazing to me, that people just wake up and come up with these phenomenal ideas that just change and revolutionize something. And I think that that's extremely exciting to look forward to, whatever that may be.
Thank you. Thank you both for a very inspiring webinar. We really had a lot of good ideas. It's very honest, authentic, and it was very good to hear about your journey. Next week, I want to remind everyone that we have a panel addressing transportation. Jesse Lohr joining us from Greenwave EV. We have James Penfold from Revision Energy explaining the different types of chargers that you could place at your workplace or collaborate with your community to put in. And Jessica Wilcox will be introducing from DES their new Empower. It's EVM Power. So it's a new program to encourage employers to install EV chargers in New Hampshire. So we invite you all to join us then, and thank you all, and see you next week.